In the last video, we talked about session, we talked about passport, and we made the app to where it will remember when someone logs in or someone registers, it will remember their username so that we could see that username on the home page. What we also did is we set the home page so that if you try to go there when you're not authenticated, it notices that and sends you to login. And so all of that is combining what we did before with session and passport so that you can basically start tracking the users in a cookie. They use a cookie to do it. They can start tracking the users, and as the user goes from page to page, you know who they are, and you can make decisions. You can look at the data, and you can customize that page for that user. In our case, we just put their name on the page, but that's the basic general approach. But one thing we did last time was we just focused on the happy path. We just focused on all the success cases and making those work. What we want to do this time is we want to focus on the problems. We want to focus on error cases and handle a lot of the cases that the users will fall into whenever they do things wrong. So let's jump into this. And so we're going to install one new library this time. It's called express messages. So let's do npm install express messages -- save. And the idea of the flash here is for you to be able to save a warning and hold it temporarily. So let's say you do a post to a login and you do something wrong. It can redirect you somewhere else, maybe even back to login, and then over the redirect still remember the error, because by default the web is stateless, and so it wouldn't actually remember that over a redirect. So we're going to use flash to remember that temporarily for that redirect so we can display the messages. So let's jump in. We've installed it now. Let's get things implemented. Okay, first thing we need to do is we need to go to server and we need to bring that in. This flash stuff is set up as middleware, so we'll go down and is related to the session stuff. So let's just put it in this section, app.use flash. And so this sets the flash up as middleware, and so now we can actually start using it anytime we want. What we're going to do at first is we're just going to let passport use it, and then whenever we get to some code here in this video later on, I'll show you how you can manually add stuff to flash before you redirect somebody somewhere. So this puts it here. This will make it available for passport to use. By default though, passport's not going to do anything with it. And so what we need to do is we need to go to our login here, because we're going to deal with our login cases first. Is we're going to go to login, and I want to turn on flash messaging for this. So that's failure flash true. And so this will tell passport to start storing messages in the flash area, in the flash memory, so that we can use them. So let's see if we can start messing with that. Okay, so if you have an error here, we need to be able to see it somehow. We'll start with console logging just to find it. And so if you have a problem with logging in, you always redirect back to login. And so you do a post, it fails, you do a redirect, which is a get to login, which means it's really in login that we need to look at that information. You can get to flash messages by calling res, this is for the response.locals.get messages. And so this will return some data. Well, we're going to return data. Let's put it in a variable. So we get the flash messages out, and let's just console log them for now. Server restarted. I've lost my browser. There it is. So we'll start with login. Do a regular get to login. Nothing's happening. We see flash. There are no messages. It's just an empty object. Let's try just posting a login without putting any information in. So we see, aha, an error has been added. Now, we didn't type that information in anywhere, this whole missing credentials message. That was actually entered in by Passport. That's just built into it. And so since there's no credentials, it noticed that, and then it puts this error in the flash. So let's make that show up, because that's not going to do any good for the user, because the user doesn't see our console logs. And so if we get messages back, we should probably put those messages on the page. And so this is how I would probably approach it. So we're going to go down a slightly different path here in the code if there are errors. You don't have to quite handle it this way, but I will. If flash messages dot error. So in other words, if there are any errors, and so that's flash messages is this object, and then error is the key for them. So if there is an error key, that means something went wrong. And so I will have an error path. If everything is fine, I will res.render login, just like I did before. It's only in the error case where I'm going to do something different. So in the error case, what I want to do is I want to show the errors and pass them in. And so I'm going to do res.render, once again login, except I'm going to pass in an object with information. Now, I could just use an entirely different view if I wanted to. An error view that just has very different HTML or whatnot. That's actually fine, because I could just render a different template name at this point. But I'm going to make this template where it'll work in either case. And so I want to have a property called show errors. So I can say, okay, if there are errors, then I want to show them. And that'll be undefined in the case of a happy path. And then I want to get the errors, and I want to get flash message is dot error. And so if we look at that console log we were getting, flash messages dot error is an array of errors. And so we should expect that this will be an array, and of course this is a Boolean. And so let's go take a look at the login mustache view. All right, so we have it as it was before. We've got the form. Let's put a section below, and I'm going to create a new div, give it a class of errors. No, not a div. I'm going to create an unordered list. So if and when there are multiple errors, we'll actually show multiple things. And so I'm going to have that here, and if there's list items, they'll show up here. So right now I just hard-coded this data, and the reason why I hard-coded this data is so I can go here and I can just deal with the styling and not have to worry about any of the user states or use cases or anything like that. So here it is. We'll make this data dynamic here in a second. Let's go to our CSS. And add some styling. I want a really light red. I'm trying to think. Let's do an RGBA, so a 255 of red, 0, 0 of green and blue, and a 0.3 alpha. So let's see how that looks. That looks okay. I think I might back off on that pink color a little bit more right there. Okay, I'm also going to make the list items inside red as well. And I'm going to remove the list style type. So So there we go. We have our error message. Now I actually don't want that moved so far to the left, and so I need to do something about that. Well, there's this padding on the inside of unordered list, 40 pixels of padding that comes default, so I want to deal with that. And let's go with 10 pixels all around for padding, and that should solve that problem. So this is what an error message is going to look like right now. And so now let's make this dynamic, now that we've done a little bit of styling. So to make this dynamic, instead of having this hard-coded, I'm going to use these two values that I put in here. One was show errors, and so I can do this and just hide this whole thing completely. And just say show errors. So if we are to show errors, then this whole section will show up. All right, so let's try this. So if there are any errors, they will show up, but now the errors themselves are still not dynamic, so let's do that. We named our property errors, so we can do our mustache thing here and essentially loop over that array. And now, in theory, everything's good. In theory, let's go fresh, no problems. If we just do login, we're going to get missing credentials. Success. This works swimmingly. Okay, let's try another error. What happens if we pass in some information for a user that doesn't exist? Oh, snap. Well, we need some sort of messaging there. If we look at our console log, we can see there was no flash message. So we need to figure out how to do that. Well, how you do that is, let's go to our passport config and our strategy function. So whenever we set up our local strategy, we had this user authenticate if else situation going on here. This is actually the error. Local strategy could not find the user or some such. And we know that because of this message here in the terminal. And so what we need to do is at that point is put in a flash message. Because Passport knows how to use flash, we can actually just pass in an object right here. And so this object, you just basically give it a message key and give it a message. So either the username or password was invalid. Let's try that. Server's restarting. Come here fresh, we're good. Put in nonsense. Either the username or password is invalid. Okay, so we fell into that case. We've got that one. So we've got that, we've got nothing submitted, so that's missing credentials. And let's, of course, make sure our happy path still works. There we go. That worked out pretty well. Log out, missing credentials, bad credentials. Okay, so that's login. And that's basically just using the flash stuff that's built into Passport. And we did this primarily through two things. One is whenever we set up in our auth.js, in our routes, whenever on the post for login for Passport, we set failure flash to true. Without that, flash stuff does not work. So that's the first thing, and that's actually how we got our missing credentials. And then on the strategy side of things, for this error here, we passed in a message, and so this message makes it into the flash messaging, this third parameter here. And so that is ultimately how we got our custom message for whenever they entered invalid username or password. So that's how that got there. And so login is, at least at this point, covered enough. It's good enough for us to at least call this functional. Let's look at registration and see what happens there, because I think there's going to be some things we need to do. So register. What kind of errors are we possibly going to get here? Well, they're going to be similar to what we had before. You've got username and password that needs to be put in. Let's see what happens if we don't. Well, bad request. We get a bad request because in our user schema, and so let's go look at Adam. In our user schema, we put username and password hashes required. That's one error scenario that we need to handle. There's another error scenario. Let's kill our terminal there or clear it. Let's put in Tanis. I already have a user called Tanis registered in this database. Let's try to do another one and see what happens. We get an unauthorized. Wow, what's that? Well, if we look here, we've got a problem. We've got trying to post Tanis. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. Trying to post Tanis, and it said a duplicate key error was found, and that's because I tried to insert two users with the same name. Going back to our user schema, I also marked the username as unique. And so we have two scenarios. There's required, and then there is unique. We can handle the required aspect of this purely from the express side, from express validations. We don't need to talk to Mongo at all if they didn't put username and password in. So I'm going to show you how to use express validations. I'm also going to show you how you can look at these error messages and do something about them. You don't know from your code if someone has already entered or used a username yet until you call the database and find that out. And so we're going to go try to save the data, look at the error message, and do some flash messaging based on that. So that's 2 bits of validations we're going to be doing. Let's start this registration validation exercise with setting up express-validator and doing some of the validation that you've done before. And so if we go to server, we're going to need to bring this in. So of course, we haven't even installed this yet, so let's do that. Okay, so we have that installed. Express-validator is a piece of middleware. And so right under body parser, I'm going to put it here because it is related to body stuff that's passed in. I'm going to put app.use, and I'm going to say express-validator. So this hooks up express-validator as middleware, and now we can use this wherever we want to. And so I'm going to go over here to auth and to register. And so when somebody posts, we need to start looking and seeing what they posted to see if it's valid. And so let's do that. We're going to check 2 things first, which is the username and the password. Make sure those are both there. So request.checkBody. We're going to make sure that the username is there. So username is required. There we go. And we do need to do not empty. And then password. Password is required as well. And also not empty. So with those validations set up, we can get a validation result. Okay, so now that we have our validation result, we can take a look and see our status here. So if the result.isEmpty is false, well, that means that there are error messages. Bad. Our else is good. Okay, so if there are no error messages, we're going to continue on with the actual registration. But there's no point in talking to Mongo at all if people didn't put in information. And so that's where we're going to start. This is the result is empty part. So if it is empty, we need to get those messages and display them to the user. The messages here, we've already set them up to check the body for username and password, and these are good messages to show. We need to get those and show them. So let's do it. Let's say result.array, and so this will get our messages as an array, and so then we can do this. We can for each over that array. And say request.flash. And so this is the first time you've seen this in this video. Request.flash is what you can use to manually add flash messages. So I'm going to add an error here. And it's going to be the property for this in the express-validator messaging is MSG for message. And so what this will do is this will essentially add each error to the flash messages. And then whenever we're done here, we'll say redirect back to register. All right, so what that will do then, will redirect us back here, and we're essentially back to where we were with login before, where we need to be able to get the messages to see what's going on. So let's do it. So let's try that as is and see if everything works out okay. So username and password, our scenario is we're trying to not pass anything in here to see what happens. Something didn't quite work. I actually don't want to get that response. What I want to do is I want to redirect, and so I'm going to go take a look at what I've got and see if I did something wrong. And so here's really what I want. I want to redirect to register and not go down this path that causes the error. And so how am I going to do that? Well, first of all, I need to figure out what's going on. And so I am going to console log some things. Or, hey, look, I can see some errors. All right, so these have to do with the error messages down here, which I'm trying not to get to. I wonder if something's not working here. So let's console log result. Actually, console log this here. Our server's restarting. Let's hit register. We get the big red error message. But I wonder if we got any errors from right here. So we're looking for a line that says errors. There they are, errors. Man, this is hard to read. I should do something about this. But let's see, am I getting any errors back? Is empty. You know what? I might need to call is empty to see my result. Let's clear this because this is going to make things a lot easier. Register, do it wrong, go back, scroll up to the top, and let's see. There was an error saving the user, and through this I'm seeing something that's weird. Is errors or false? Is it empty? It's false. That means there are errors, but all this other stuff is happening first. That tells me, and those errors are coming from Mongo, that tells me that I have something wrong with my sequence. So let's think through the sequence of this function. I'm setting up to check the username and password. I'm getting a validation result, and then when that's done, this is firing. The reason why I'm having a sequence error is the code is continuing on down here before this ever fires. I actually don't want to do any of this code at all unless the validation succeeds. So what I should have done is move all that up into the good case. I should have done this 5 minutes ago, and then I wouldn't be having these issues. So now let's try it again. And let's clean up this errors is empty. Clean up that message right there. Clean this up, and let's try it again. I'm feeling confident. Is errors is empty is false. Well, that's because I have errors. Excellent. And then I got redirected to register. And I can see that I do, in fact, have 2 flash messages. The username is required and password is required. Excellent. Okay, so we found an error in our own code, in my own logic. We've worked through it. I don't need this console log anymore. And I'm getting my flash messages right here. And so this means I can now start showing them on the page. So let's take a similar approach. I've got my login mustache code here. I want to use this same bit in register. So here we're going to show these errors if we have it, and so it's going to be similar to what we did with login. And so with login, we check to see if flash messages.error had something in it. So let's go down here and say if flash messages.error has something, we're in our error case. Otherwise, we will simply render the registration page. Now, in the case where there is an error, what we need to do, or there are a group of errors, is we need to get all of those errors and we need to bundle them up and stick them into the registration page. So res.render, register. There was one property I needed to set, so show errors. So show errors is true. And then I think the other property was called errors, and it was. And I need to get that out of flash messages.error, if I recall. Server has restarted. Let's do it. Yay! So we are now showing that the username and the password are both required. Excellent. There's one final case, and I think we're done. In this final case is the situation where somebody tries to register and that username is already taken. That is still showing this error right here, and we're getting a big wall of text in our console when this happens. So let's take a look at our code and see what we can do about this. So in the register for the post, we've got our happy path, which is down here. And so the first failure path is just based on if username and password have been submitted. It's not based on any data in the database, because it can't, because it doesn't know about all the data in the database. So what we need to do to get this next error is actually try to save the data and see if any errors come back. So here in our happy path, we create the user. We create the user, and then we attempt to call save. And look, there's an error field. We should be able to use that. We should be able to look in that and make a decision on whether or which error message we should actually show. And if, of course, if there is no error, send people to the home route. So let's do it. If there is an error, what we don't want to do is we don't want to call next, which is moves them along the path to send them down to home. We don't want to do that. What we want to do instead is we want to add messages to Flash, and then we want to redirect them back to register. So let's do it. In the case where there's no error, we will indeed just call next. But in the case where there's not, where there is an error, we will request.flash and say error, something bad happened. We're not going to leave it at this. We're actually going to look at the error in a minute to see if we can do something more intelligent. So let's look at this as is. Let's clear the terminal. Let's go back to register and redo this again. If I try to re-register the same user, I apparently forgot to do something, which is actually redirect them back to register. I'll do that in a second. But we can still already, before we do that, go look at the error that we got back from Mongo. Mongo told us there was an error saving the user, Mongo error, duplicate key error. There we go, duplicate key error. I have a requirement in my schema that the usernames must be unique. Because I'm re-entering the same username, I'm getting a duplicate key error. And this is in this in a property, it looks like it's called Mongo error. I believe we can also look at a property called message. Here it is, message as well. So let's take a look and see what we can do about this. So we can interrogate error if error.message.index of is greater than -1. This means I have a duplicate key error, and I can say that this username is already in use. So request.flash username already in use. I'm not sure what all the different errors I could possibly get here are, so what I'm going to do in this particular case is say, if I know it's this error, I'm going to have this very specific error saying you have to use another username. If I actually don't know, I'm going to put something a little bit more generic and just say there was an error or a problem with your registration. Okay. So now we don't need this right here where we were doing the something bad happened, very generic error. Now, what I failed to do earlier, and which is why we were getting an endless request, is I never actually ended this request. And so I will go ahead and do that now. And redirect everyone who fails back to register. And let's see how this works. So server has restarted. I go to register. Here is the error I had before. That all still works. If I put in Tanis, who is already a registered user, I get username already in use. If I put Tasselhoff, who is also a registered user, that one's already in use. If I put Karaman, and this is not a user yet, if I register, the registration works, and boom, Karaman is now in the system. Okay. So those are the basic ideas. Now there are other things that we can improve on this. You might have noticed some level of duplication in the views, and in some of this logic, like for example, both the gets for the login and register have this same exact block of code. We could find a good way of sharing that. It actually wouldn't be too hard, so they have that same block of code. There's also a lot of duplication in our templates. Those would be good things to do, good things to fix, good things to deal with, but we're not going to deal with them right now, because the focus on this is authentication, session, passport stuff. So we're basically at the end. We've done a lot here actually in these number of videos. We've done our basic setup. We got Mongoose set up with bcrypt. We created a user model. We logged in people. We registered people. Then we went to session and passport so that we could remember who the users are across pages. And first we were just dealing with the happy path with no error messaging. So we got that done. So then we got into the Flash messaging, and we got into express-validator so we can check things there. And that's what we've done now over a number of videos. Setting this stuff up is not a trivial exercise. The good news is you often only have to do this once for a site, and then you can mostly leave it alone. That tends to be the case. But you never know. Some projects you'll do this kind of authentication, and then you'll do Google authentication, then you'll do Twitter authentication, and you have some more things to mess with. But at the very least, this is a walkthrough of how I would set up Passport in session with MongoDB.